The message reached me at 4:42 in the morning, while the desert outside Camp Arifshan was still black and the air conditioner above my bed was making the same tired knocking sound it had made for 6 straight months. My mother's name appeared first. Under it was a photograph of my younger brother standing on a hotel stage in Nashville with an American flag behind him and a brass plaque in his hands. He was smiling so wide that the tendons showed in his neck. The message said, "Brent won the Army contract. Do not call and spoil this for him. Your name only helped with the paperwork. We will explain when you get home." I read those 3 sentences once. Then I opened the photograph. The plaque said Prairie Forge Industrial Supply, Supplier of the Year. Behind Brent was a banner with a company logo I had never seen. Below the logo, in letters large enough to read from across the ballroom, were the words, "Founded and led by Chief Warrant Officer Nathan Cole, Service-Disabled Veteran." That was the first surprise. The second arrived before I had finished enlarging the picture. An email dropped into my personal account from a finance company in Kansas City. It thanked me for personally guaranteeing a receivables line worth $760,000 for Prairie Forge Industrial Supply. The signature block at the bottom listed me as president and majority owner. The third surprise was buried in the attached loan summary. The collateral was not only the federal contract, it included my paid-off house outside Salina and my mother's home in Wichita. For about 10 seconds, all I could hear was the air conditioner and the faraway hum of generators beyond the concrete barriers. Then I opened the federal award notice linked in the email. The contract was worth a little over $3,400,000. It called for high-pressure hydraulic hose assemblies used on Army recovery vehicles. I had spent most of my adult life around equipment like that. A bad hose does not simply inconvenience somebody. It can burst under load, drop a boom, spray hot fluid, and put a soldier in a hospital before anyone understands what failed. My brother had not only put my name on a company I did not own, he had attached my military record to parts that troops might have to trust with their hands and their lives. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my own face on the banner. The photograph they had used was an official portrait from my promotion ceremony 2 years earlier. My uniform had been cropped at the waist, my rank was visible, so were my ribbons. Someone had taken the image from my mother's social media page, cleaned up the background, and turned 34 years of service into a sales tool. A knock came at my door. "Chief, you awake?" Master Sergeant Lyle Benton called from the hallway. "Convoy brief. Moved up 20 minutes. I told him I was awake. He stepped in while I was pulling on my boots. Lyle had known me long enough to notice when I was quieter than usual, which was saying something because quiet had never exactly been in short supply with me. "You look like somebody mailed you a live grenade," he said. "Close," I told him. "My family put my name on one." I showed him the photograph, but not the loan papers. He studied the banner, then looked at me. "You own a supply company now?" "Apparently I own 51% of one. Do you?" "No." Lyle stopped smiling. I opened my mother's message again. There was something almost childlike in the confidence behind it. Your name only helped with the paperwork. As if paperwork were decoration. As if a signature were no more serious than a ribbon around a gift. People who have never worked in maintenance sometimes think the machine is the important thing. It is not. The record is what tells you who built the part, who inspected it, where the material came from, and who accepted responsibility when it entered the system. A part without traceability is only a story in a box. My brother had spent years selling stories in boxes. That morning, he had finally placed me inside one. I typed a response to my mother. "Tell Brent, the paperwork looks complete." I read it twice. Then I sent it. Her reply came almost immediately. "Please do not overreact. We all pull together to make this happen." That was my family's favorite expression. We pull on the same rope. My father used to say it when Brent and I were boys and an old tractor had sunk axle deep in Kansas mud. Back then it meant stand together, lean at the same time, and do not let go when the work gets hard. After my father died, my mother kept the words and changed the meaning. In her version, Brent chose the direction, I supplied the strength, and everyone called it unity. What none of them knew was that I had been watching the rope tighten for nearly 5 months. I had copies of the altered company filing. I had saved the sign-in alerts from a government account I had never created. I had an identity theft report drafted and waiting. I had already told my command that someone might be trying to use my military status in a private business. Most important, I had a question I had not yet been able to answer. Were they using my name merely to qualify for the contract? Or had they built the entire arrangement so I would carry the blame when it failed? Before I tell you what I did next, answer that question for yourself. If your own family used your military record, your disability letter, and your signature to win a government contract, Would you call them first, or would you call the office that awarded it? Put your answer in the comments. I made the call that kept me awake for the next 3 nights, but it was not the call they expected. I did not call Brent. I finished the convoy brief. That may sound cold to people who grew up in families where a phone call could still solve something. In my family, a phone call was usually where the problem went to be renamed. Theft became borrowing. Pressure became concern. A lie became a misunderstanding if my mother said it softly enough. I had spent too many years stepping into conversations with facts and walking out carrying guilt to believe that one more argument would suddenly make everybody honest. I was 54 years old that summer, a Chief Warrant Officer 4 in the Army Reserve, and close enough to retirement that younger soldiers had started asking me questions, beginning with the words, "Back in your day." My military specialty was maintenance and parts accountability. In plain English, I spent my time making sure equipment had what it needed, records matched reality, and nobody solved the shortage by moving a bad part from one shelf to another. My civilian job was similar. I inspected maintenance systems for a regional electric utility. It was not glamorous work, but neither is keeping a town's power on during an ice storm. Glamour has never been much use at 3 in the morning. I joined the Army at 19 after 1 year at a technical college I could no longer afford. My father, Hugh Cole, owned a farm equipment repair shop north of Wichita. He could rebuild a transmission by sound, tell a bent shaft from a worn bearing with his fingertips, and make a customer feel as though a broken combine was a moral emergency. He was a good mechanic and a complicated father. Brent was 7 years younger than I was. By the time he reached high school, the repair shop was doing well enough for my parents to give him things they had called impossible when I asked. A used truck, tuition at a private business college, a paid summer in Europe that was described as broadening his horizons. I received a birthday card in basic training with $20 tucked inside and a note from my mother reminding me that sacrifice built character. For a long time, I believed the difference made sense. I was older, I was tougher. I had chosen the Army. Brent was sensitive, creative, full of plans. He needed encouragement. That was the word my mother used. Encouragement usually came in the form of money, access, second chances, and someone else cleaning up after the first chance had gone wrong. I became the son people called when there was a practical problem. Brent became the son people toasted when there was good news. When the water heater failed, I paid half. When my mother's roof needed replacement, I used 2 weeks of leave to help strip shingles and then covered the materials she could not afford. When Brent opened his first industrial supply company, I lent him $48,000 from the insurance money my wife Ellen had left me. He promised to repay it within 18 months. He repaid $3,000. When I asked about the rest, my mother told me the business was finally finding its feet and this was not the time to put a boot on its neck. That was how she said things. She could turn a request for repayment into an act of violence without raising her voice. Ellen saw the pattern before I did. She had been a school librarian, a woman with a patient face and a dangerous ability to remember the exact words people used when they thought nobody was keeping score. We were married for 21 years. She died from ovarian cancer 8 years before the message in Kuwait. During her last year, when treatments had reduced our world to hospital rooms, pharmacy lines, and whatever food she could keep down, Brent called twice to ask how she was doing and 6 times to discuss cash flow. The last time he called, Ellen was asleep in the next room. He wanted me to guarantee a line of credit for a new warehouse lease. I told him no. He said, "You do not have children, Nate. What are you saving all that money for?" I remember looking through the bedroom doorway at Ellen's thin hand resting above the blanket. I told him I was saving it for a life that still belonged to me. My mother did not speak to me for nearly a month after that. Ellen, when she felt well enough, made us grilled cheese sandwiches and said, "Your family treats your steadiness like a public utility. They notice it only when you stop supplying it." That sentence stayed with me. After she died, I became easier to use in one sense and harder in another. Easier because grief made quiet look like agreement. Harder because Ellen had left me with the habit of writing things down. She kept a small notebook in the kitchen for promises, appointments, and household repairs. Nothing dramatic, just dates, names, and what had been said. After her funeral, I found an entry from the week before she went into hospice. Brent called about warehouse again. Nathan said no. Nathan is allowed to say no. I tore out that page and carried it behind my driver's license for years. My father died 2 winters later. He left the repair shop itself to Brent because Brent had been running the front office by then. I received a narrow parcel of land behind the shop with an old metal building on it, the place where my father stored obsolete tools and tractors too stubborn to scrap. I did not resent the division as much as people assumed. The building was paid for, the land was mine, and it gave me somewhere to work with my hands when I was home. I repaired lawn tractors for neighbors, rebuilt an old military trailer, and kept Ellen's gardening tools lined up along one wall, even though I had never been able to grow tomatoes the way she did. There was one tool from my father's shop I had expected to find in that building and never did. It was a brown wooden case holding a precision micrometer he had owned since before I was born. He taught me to use it when I was 12. Measure twice, he would say. Metal does not care what you meant to cut. After his funeral, I asked Brent about it. He told me the tool had probably been sold with a lot of old equipment. My mother said she did not remember it at all. I let the matter go, but I never quite forgot the empty space on the shelf where the case should have been. Prairie Forge Industrial Supply grew out of my father's repair shop. Brent stopped fixing machines and started buying components from distributors, marking them up, and selling them to farms, trucking companies, and municipal garages. He was good in a room. He remembered names, laughed at the right volume, and knew how to make a customer feel that buying from him was a vote for small-town America. What he was not good at was margin, discipline, inventory control, or admitting that a deal had gone bad. His wife, Vanessa, handled marketing. She had never served a day in the military, but she understood what a flag could do to a brochure. After my father died, the company website began using words like duty, honor, mission, and readiness. Photographs of Brent in work boots appeared beside photographs of soldiers he did not know. One Veterans Day, Vanessa asked for a picture of me in uniform for a family tribute. I sent one. It was the same picture that later appeared on the banner in Nashville. My mother, Marlene, was 77 and still lived in the brick ranch house where Brent and I grew up. She kept important documents in a steel box at the bottom of her bedroom closet. Birth certificates, insurance policies, my father's discharge papers from his brief service in the Air Force. After Ellen died and I began accepting longer mobilizations, I added an emergency folder of my own. It contained a copy of my will, my military orders, my discharge records from earlier active duty periods, my Department of Veterans Affairs disability letter, a copy of my passport, and a limited power of attorney allowing my mother to handle repairs at my house if a storm or pipe leak occurred while I was overseas. The power of attorney had an expiration date. It did not authorize business transactions. It did not authorize loans. It did not authorize anyone to form a company in my name. I had explained that when we signed it in front of a notary. My mother had nodded and said, "I know, Nathan. We are not strangers." That was true. A stranger would have needed to break into the box. My disability rating came from hearing loss in my left ear and damage to my right shoulder after a vehicle rollover during a deployment years earlier. It was not a dramatic disability. I could work, lift, drive, and pass the Army fitness requirements for my age. The rating mattered because it acknowledged injuries connected to service. It also made me eligible, under certain rules, to own a business that could compete for contracts reserved for service-disabled veterans. I had never applied for that certification. I had never planned to own a federal supply company. I knew enough about government contracting to understand that qualifying status was not a souvenir you lent to a relative. The veteran had to genuinely own the required share and genuinely control the business. The title on the paper and the decisions in the office had to belong to the same person. Brent knew that much too. He had asked me about it 3 years earlier over barbecue at my mother's house. He said, "Seems like the government ought to give something back to guys like you." I told him those programs were for veterans actually running businesses. He smiled and said, "Rules always sound tighter before somebody learns where the hinges are." At the time, I thought it was another Brent joke. He had a talent for saying questionable things in a tone that made caution seem humorless. By then, I had already stopped funding his company. I still paid my mother's property taxes twice when her pension fell short. I still covered the insurance on her car. I still repaired anything in her house I could reach with a ladder. But I would not sign another business document for Brent, and I would not lend him another dollar. That boundary changed the way they spoke about me. I became rigid, suspicious, too military. My mother said the Army had trained the softness out of me. Brent said Ellen's death had made me bitter. Vanessa said I did not understand the risks entrepreneurs had to take. They were wrong about one thing. I understood risk very well. Risk is not courage. Risk is exposure multiplied by consequence. Courage is deciding who has the right to accept it. The first warning that my family had decided to accept risk in my name came 5 months before the Nashville photograph. It arrived disguised as a question about a tax form. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon while I was packing for mobilization. She asked whether my disability letter showed the percentage or only stated that the condition was connected to service. I was standing in my garage with a duffel bag open on the floor. The question stopped my hands. "Why do you need to know?" "The county sent something about veterans and property taxes," she said. I thought maybe your paperwork could help me understand it. My property was in a different county. My mother had never shown interest in the wording of a federal benefits letter. I told her the county assessor could explain any exemption that applied to her, and I changed the subject. 2 weeks later, Brent called. He spent 10 minutes asking about my deployment, then asked whether a reservist on active orders could still manage a civilian company. I said that depended on the company and the rules involved. He said, hypothetically, could the owner appoint somebody else while he was gone? I asked what he was really trying to do. He laughed and said Vanessa had read an article about veteran businesses. Then he told me I had become incapable of casual conversation. The third warning was electronic. 3 days before I flew out, I received a security code for a government sign-in account I had not attempted to access. The message said someone was trying to add a new authentication method. I changed the password, removed an unfamiliar recovery email, and saved screenshots. The recovery address contained my first initial, my last name, and the birth year Brent often used in company passwords. It was not proof, but it was not nothing. I called Major Elena Ruiz at the Legal Assistance Office on post. Elena had helped me update my will before deployment. She listened, then asked whether anyone in my family had access to copies of my military records. My mother does. Does she have a signature sample? Enough to fill a museum. Elena did not laugh. She said, a single forged page can become an argument. A pattern of forged pages becomes evidence. Preserve the pattern before you confront the people making it. She explained that the Legal Assistance Office could advise me on identity protection and military disclosure, but a private business and federal procurement issue would require civilian counsel. She also told me to notify my security manager and commander early if my name might appear in outside business records. Silence, she said, could create the wrong impression later, even if I had done nothing. The next morning, I briefed my commander. I showed him the sign-in alert and described my family's questions. I expected skepticism. Instead, he asked for a written memorandum for the record and told me to keep him updated. That was the first document in the file. I named the folder Traceline because traceability was the whole problem. Every screenshot went in with a date. Every call became a short note written immediately afterward. I changed passwords, froze my civilian credit, moved the emergency folder out of my mother's house during a final visit, and formally revoked the limited power of attorney even though it was close to expiring. I sent the revocation by certified mail to my mother and recorded it with the county office where my house was located. She called the day the envelope arrived. What is this supposed to mean? It means I am leaving for 9 months and simplifying my paperwork. You could have trusted me enough to say that first. I almost admired the speed of it. I had revoked authority she did not need, and somehow I was the one who had broken trust. A month after I reached Kuwait, a packet addressed to me as managing member of Prairie Forge was forwarded from my house to my military mail address. It came from a commercial compliance service and included an amended operating agreement prepared for the company. According to the document, I had acquired 51% of Prairie Forge and become its managing member. The signature looked like mine if you had seen my name once on a Christmas card. The N leaned too far forward. The C in coal closed at the top, something mine had not done since I broke my right index finger in Iraq. Whoever copied it had used an old sample. My attorney requested the complete file from the compliance service and Prairie Forge's registered agent. His name was Martin Hale, a federal procurement lawyer. Martin was 61, wore bow ties without irony, and had spent 3 decades explaining to confident business owners that the government considered words like own and control to be verbs, not decorations. We met by secure video after my duty day. He read the amended agreement and tapped one paragraph with his pen. This says you contributed $120,000 in capital, he said. I contributed nothing. This says you have sole authority over long-term decisions. I had never seen the company bank account. This says your brother manages daily operations under a written active duty designation from you. I did not sign one. Martin leaned back. The rule does allow a reserve component veteran called to active duty to designate someone to control the company during that period. It does not allow relatives to invent the veteran, invent the ownership, and invent the designation. That was the hinge Brent believed he had found. My deployment was not an obstacle to his plan. It was the cover story. He could tell reviewers that I genuinely owned the company but had temporarily delegated control because the army had sent me overseas. My absence made it harder for anyone to ask me direct questions. My uniform made the application look respectable. My disability letter supplied the eligibility. My mother's document box supplied everything else. Martin sent a notice disputing the filing and instructed me not to communicate with Prairie Forge until we knew how far the false records had traveled. I filed an identity theft report. I gave a copy to my bank, my credit monitoring service, and my command. Then Martin contacted the certification program and stated that I did not own or control Prairie Forge and had not authorized an application in my name. For several weeks, nothing visible happened. That silence was harder than I expected. People imagine action as a series of doors opening. Most real investigations begin with doors closing quietly while somebody on the other side checks dates. I went to work. I inspected vehicle records, reviewed shortage reports, and sat through meetings where men half my age used the phrase circle back, often enough to make it lose all meaning. At night, I checked the traceline folder and wondered whether I had misread the situation. Then my niece Avery called. Avery was Brent's oldest daughter. She was 24 and had taken a bookkeeping job at Prairie Forge after finishing community college. She was careful in a family that rewarded charm. As a child, she used to line up crayons by length before she colored. As an adult, she backed up the company's payroll files every Friday on a red external drive she kept clipped inside her purse because Brent had once lost a month of records and blamed the computer. We had always been close in the quiet way some relatives are close. I fixed her first car. She helped me plant tulips at Ellen's grave. We did not speak every week, but we never had to perform affection when we did. That night, her voice sounded thin. Uncle Nate, do you really own Dad's company? No. There was a pause. Are you sure you did not sign something before you left? I am sure. Another pause. Longer this time. She said, then I think you need to see what they put in the certification file. I asked what she had found. She whispered, not on the phone. The call ended. The next morning, a message appeared in a private email account only Avery and I used for family photographs. There was no attachment, just one sentence. I still do the Friday backup. That was when I stopped wondering whether the forged ownership papers were the whole scheme. Martin arranged a way for Avery to transfer the files without sending them through the company network. He did not tell me every detail, and I did not ask. There are moments when curiosity becomes interference. 3 days later, he called me during my lunch break and asked whether I was somewhere private. I walked behind a maintenance shelter where the wind carried fine sand against the metal siding like dry rain. He said, your niece gave us a complete copy of the application package, internal emails, lender correspondence, and supplier invoices. How bad? Bad enough that I want you to hear the sequence before you react. The certification application listed me as majority owner, president, and final decision maker. It included my disability letter, my official portrait, a copy of my passport, and an operating agreement with my forged signature on every page. It also included a written designation stating that because I had been called to active duty, I had temporarily appointed Brent to control operations on my behalf. That document carried a notary stamp from a woman who rented office space in the same building as Prairie Forge. The date showed I had signed it in Wichita on a Tuesday when Army travel records placed me on an aircraft between Germany and Kuwait. Paper does not raise its voice. It does not need to. The lender file was worse. Prairie Forge had been losing money for 14 consecutive months. Brent owed $684,000 on an equipment and inventory line. The bank had given him until the end of October to restore the required financial ratios or begin liquidation. Payroll taxes were behind. 2 major customers had stopped buying after late deliveries. The company had less than 6 weeks of cash. My mother's house was already pledged against $240,000 of that debt. I had not known that. Brent had convinced her to sign a second mortgage the previous spring, telling her a municipal contract was certain and the risk would last only 90 days. The municipal contract never came. By the time she understood the position, the house was tied to a business that was sinking faster than its inventory could be sold. The Army contract was their escape route. A private finance company had agreed to advance up to $760,000 against future federal receivables once the award was verified and the personal guarantees were complete. The advance would cure the bank default, cover payroll, and release part of the lien on my mother's home. There was only one problem. Prairie Forge did not qualify to compete for the contract. Brent was not a veteran. Vanessa was not a veteran. Nobody at the company owned the required status. I did. They had calculated that the contract would solve everything at once. My military record would open the competition. My active duty orders would explain why Brent ran the company. My house would strengthen the guarantee. If the first deliveries passed inspection, the revenue would keep the business alive. If they did not, the file said I was the owner who had approved the plan. Martin had not yet found a direct statement about shifting blame. What he had found was a pattern of people discussing my liability as though it were another company asset. One email from Vanessa to Brent said, Nathan's name gives the lender comfort because he has the pension and the house. Another from Brent said, He will complain, but he will not burn the family. He never has. I read that line 5 times. The sentence hurt more than the forged signature. A forged signature said they thought they could imitate me. That email said they believed they understood me. Then Martin opened the supplier records. Prairie Forge had bid on 600 hydraulic hose assemblies manufactured to a specific pressure, temperature, and material standard. The approved domestic supplier quoted a price that left Brent with a modest margin. 3 weeks before the bid deadline, Brent found a broker offering visually similar assemblies for less than half the cost. The broker could not provide complete material traceability. The certificates of conformance contained repeated lot numbers and inconsistent manufacturing dates. That did not prove the hoses were defective. It proved nobody could responsibly say they were not. I asked Martin to send me one redacted certificate. He did. I enlarged it on my screen and saw the problem within a minute. The lot number format belonged to a different product family. I recognized it because our unit had rejected seals from the same manufacturer 2 years earlier. Someone had copied a certificate template, changed the item description, and missed the code in the corner. Brent was not merely using my status to rescue a failing company. He was planning to create the profit he needed by substituting cheaper parts and dressing them in better paperwork. The numbers explain the panic. The substituted assemblies would increase the projected gross margin by nearly $500,000. That margin, together with the receivables advance, could save the company and my mother's house. At least on paper. In reality, one failed hose underload could injure a mechanic, damage a recovery vehicle, and trigger an inspection that would peel the whole company open. I thought about my first maintenance warrant officer, a man named Leon Price, who used to remove defective tags from rejected parts and pin them above his desk. He told young soldiers that every red tag represented a bad day that had been stopped before it became somebody's worst day. I still carried one of those old tags in my field notebook. I took it out and placed it beside the printed certificate. For most of my life, my family had treated my caution as a personality flaw. That afternoon, caution was the only thing standing between their plan and a soldier under a falling boom. I called my commander first. Then Martin and I spoke with Major Ruiz. After that, we contacted the contracting officer named on the award notice, a civilian named Dana McBride. I expected the conversation to feel accusatory. It did not. Dana asked precise questions, requested documents through a secure channel, and told me not to contact the supplier or my family about the parts. She said, "My first duty is not to your brother and it is not to you. It is to the people who may have to trust what his company delivers." That was exactly the answer I needed to hear. By the end of the day, I had submitted a sworn statement that I did not own Prairie Forge, had never authorized Brent to control it, had not signed the loan guarantee, and had no role in the bid. Martin sent the same evidence to the certification authorities and the appropriate inspector general offices. My command documented every step. Dana placed a hold on acceptance of any product while the ownership and quality questions were reviewed. The finance company froze the receivables line before releasing the first advance. My bank flagged the attempted lien against my house. Because I had revoked the power of attorney and recorded the revocation before the loan documents were submitted, the title company refused to treat the signature package as valid. That decision saved my house. It did not save my family from what they had already signed. The strange part was that while all of this was happening, Brent was still in Nashville accepting applause. The photographs came through that evening in a steady stream. Vanessa posted a picture of champagne glasses around a table at a rooftop restaurant. Brent posted the brass plaque beside a plate of steak and wrote that faith, family, and persistence had finally been rewarded. My mother posted a photograph of all three of them under the hotel lights. She was holding my old Cavalry Challenge coin between 2 fingers. I had given that coin to my father after my second deployment. He kept it in the glass cabinet above the television. After he died, I assumed my mother still had it. Seeing Brent use it as a prop did something to me that the money figures had not. The coin had no financial value. That was why it mattered. Under the photograph, my mother wrote, "Hugh would be so proud of what his boys built together. I had not built Prairie Forge. I had not approved the contract. I was 7,000 miles away trying to prevent the company from delivering unverified parts to soldiers. Yet, in the version my family displayed, my absence was cooperation and my service was decoration." My mother sent another private message a few minutes later. "I hope you see now why we could not wait for your permission. Brent had one chance to save everything. When you understand the numbers, you will thank us." I answered, "I understand the numbers." She sent a heart and wrote, "Then please do not make this harder." I put the phone away. People sometimes imagine revenge as a hot thing. They picture shouting, breaking objects, a speech delivered with perfect timing. What I felt was colder and much less satisfying. It was the same feeling I had during inspections when I realized a unit had been signing off work that nobody had actually performed. The first task was not punishment. The first task was containment. Dana's office asked Prairie Forge to provide original ownership records, proof of my capital contribution, evidence that I controlled long-term decisions, and the written active duty designation. Brent responded within hours. He sent the same forged documents and added a letter claiming I had become difficult to reach because of operational security. That was his first official decision after learning someone was asking questions. He doubled down. The certification office sent a notice of review. The contracting office kept the award in place temporarily but prohibited shipment or invoicing. The finance company required an in-person verification of my guarantee. When I declined by sworn statement, it suspended the line. Prairie Forge had planned its Nashville weekend around money that never arrived. The hotel charges still did. By the next afternoon, my phone had 23 missed calls. 11 from Brent, 6 from my mother, 4 from Vanessa, 2 from a number belonging to Prairie Forge's outside accountant. I listened to none of the voicemails until Martin told me he wanted copies. The first messages were confused. Nate, the lender is saying you disputed the guarantee. Call me. The next messages were offended. Whatever concern you have, you do not embarrass your brother in front of a bank. Then came the practical pressure. Payroll is Friday. Mom's house is tied up in this. You can ask questions after the advance clears. By evening, the language changed. You are risking jobs, real families, people who have done nothing to you. The transformation was familiar. First, they denied the problem. Then, they treated my refusal to participate as the cause of every consequence that followed. I forwarded everything to Martin without responding. Avery sent one short message. They know somebody gave you files? I asked whether she was safe. She wrote, for now. Martin helped her contact her own attorney. He was careful about that. He represented me, not her, and he repeated the distinction every time our interests touched. Avery left work early the next day with the red backup drive in her purse and stayed with a friend whose address her parents did not know. Brent called her 14 times before midnight. The lab received 2 sample hose assemblies from Prairie Forge's warehouse. Dana did not tell me where they were tested or who handled them. She only said the government would compare the materials and pressure performance against the contract requirements. Until then, the parts would not enter Army inventory. That should have given me relief. Instead, I found myself thinking about all the times Brent had sold something less dangerous to people who trusted him. Bearings, belts, filters, hydraulic fittings. A supplier can hide a lot behind a clean box and a confident invoice. I wondered how many shortcuts had built the company before he reached for my name. Martin warned me not to let the investigation expand in my mind beyond the evidence. He said suspicion had no natural stopping point. He told me, we prove what happened here. We do not rewrite every year of your childhood as a criminal file. It was good advice. I did not always follow it. On the third day, the finance company assigned a fraud officer named Celia Tran. She spoke with me by video, compared my identity documents, and reviewed the attempted guarantee. The electronic signature had been completed from an internet address registered to Prairie Forge. The phone number used for verification belonged to a prepaid device purchased near Brent's warehouse. The security questions had been answered with information from my emergency folder. Celia said, a personal guarantee is not a family favor. It is a loaded obligation. Whoever signed this expected your house and retirement income to stand behind their risk. She asked whether I wanted the lender to preserve the records for law enforcement. I said yes. That one word felt heavier than I expected. Agreeing to preserve evidence against a stranger is easy. Agreeing to preserve evidence against your brother means accepting that the future may contain courtrooms, agents, and family members who say you destroyed them. I knew that before I said yes. I said it anyway. My mother finally left a voicemail that did not mention the lender. Nathan, I know this looks wrong. Brent said it was temporary. He said once the contract was running, he would buy your share back and nobody would lose anything. I gave him the folder because he said you had already agreed in principle. I should have asked. I know that. But your brother was going to lose the company and the bank was going to take this house. I did what I thought a mother had to do. It was the first admission I had heard. It was also incomplete. She said she had given him the folder. She did not mention the second mortgage. She did not mention the false notary. She did not mention my house. Most of all, she did not ask whether the parts were safe. Her fear had narrowed the world until the family home and Brent's company were the only things inside it. I saved the voicemail. That night, I took out Ellen's notebook page and read the last line again. Nathan is allowed to say no. For years, I had treated that sentence as permission. In Kuwait, it became an instruction. Called my mother for the first time since Nashville. She answered before the first ring finished. Thank God, she said. Tell me you can fix this. I told her I could not make false documents true. She said, nobody is asking you to lie. We just need you to confirm what was meant. I never meant any of it. You meant to help your family. You always have. That was the trap inside her reasoning. If I had ever loved them, then any document claiming I had helped could be treated as spiritually accurate, no matter who signed it. I asked whether she knew Brent had pledged my house. Silence. Then she said, he said the title company would never need it once the contract started paying. Did you know he planned to supply parts without complete traceability? I do not understand parts. Nathan, did you ask? Her voice sharpened. Do not talk to me like I am one of your soldiers. I said, I would never ask one of my soldiers to sign for equipment he had not inspected. She began to cry. Not loudly. My mother rarely did anything loudly. She said I was choosing regulations over people. She said my father would have found a way to protect both sons. She said Brent had made mistakes, but prison would not bring Ellen back, as though my wife's death and my brother's fraud belonged on the same scale. I ended the call when she used Ellen's name a second time. Afterward, Lyle found me outside the dining facility with a paper cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink. He asked, how bad? I said, they want me to sign after the fact. He nodded slowly. A blank check with yesterday's date. Something like that. He looked across the floodlit gravel. You know what happens if you sign? Yes. You know what happens if you do not? I thought I did. I was wrong about that part. The following morning, Avery's attorney delivered a second set of files from the red drive. Inside was an email chain that answered the question I had carried since the first photograph. They had not merely expected me to keep quiet. They had prepared to make me responsible. The chain began with Vanessa asking how they should answer if the certification reviewer tried to contact me directly. Brent replied that my deployment made direct contact unlikely. He said they would use the active duty designation and explained that operational demands prevented me from participating in routine matters. Then their accountant asked the question that should have stopped everything. What if Nathan denies ownership? Brent's answer was only 2 lines. He will not. If he does, the signed file makes it his problem too. A second message followed 10 minutes later. The company is in his name. The guarantee is in his name. If there is a quality issue, he is the controlling owner on record. Martin read the words aloud. I asked him to read them again, not because I had missed anything, but because the first hearing did not feel real enough to hold. There it was, the plan beneath the plan. Brent believed my sense of duty would keep me from reporting him. If that failed, he believed the documents would spread the damage until protecting myself required protecting him. He had turned my reputation into both bait and cover. I did not feel rage. Rage would have been cleaner. I felt grief with a hard edge on it. Grief for a brother I had apparently known only when knowing me benefited him. Martin asked whether I wanted to hear the rest of the chain. I said yes. Vanessa had worried that a failed inspection might bring investigators to the warehouse. Brent replied that the first shipment only had to pass visual acceptance. After the receivables advance cleared, they could replace later lots with parts from the approved supplier. In his mind, the unverified hoses were a bridge. Once the company reached the other side, he would build something safer behind him. That is how people justify dangerous shortcuts. They imagine risk belongs only to the temporary period. They never picture the person standing under the temporary failure. The lab report came 2 days later. Dana called Martin and me together. The sample assemblies had not met the required pressure performance. One fitting separated before reaching the contract threshold. The inner tube material also showed signs of softening at elevated temperature. The government rejected the samples and maintained the stop on performance. Dana did not dramatize it. She did not need to. She said, "These assemblies will not enter the supply system." I looked at the old red tag in my notebook. One bad day stopped. The ownership review and the quality concern now moved on separate tracks. I was a witness and a victim in one. In the other, I was the person whose identity had been used to lend credibility to a potentially unsafe supply chain. My command restricted me from any official involvement beyond providing information. That boundary protected the process in me. For the next 2 months, my life became divided between ordinary military work and extraordinary personal paperwork. I inspected engine records in the morning and answered attorney questions at night. I signed affidavits. I authenticated travel dates. I supplied old signature samples. I explained why the break in my finger had changed the way I wrote the letter C. I showed where my official portrait had first been posted and who could access the original file. Every detail that had once seemed too small to matter became part of a line. Prairie Forge's situation deteriorated quickly. Without the finance advance, Brent could not cure the bank default. Without permission to deliver, he could not invoice the army. The broker demanded payment for the unverified hoses. The approved supplier, after learning its certificates had been imitated, refused further business. Employees began leaving when paychecks arrived late. My mother's second mortgage moved from a distant risk to a monthly notice on her kitchen table. She called me every Sunday. I answered every third or fourth call, depending on what I could handle, without saying something permanent. Her messages shifted between apology, bargaining, and accusation. One week she said, I was frightened and I made a terrible decision. The next week she said, you could end this with one signature. Both statements were true from where she stood. That was what made them dangerous. Brent stopped apologizing entirely. His voicemails became lectures about loyalty and scale. He said nobody had been hurt. He said the parts had never shipped. He said the government wasted more money before lunch than his contract was worth. He said the certification rules were political theater. He said I was letting strangers destroy a business our father had built. Our father had built a repair shop around the idea that measurements mattered. Brent had built a supply company around the hope that nobody would measure closely. Avery resigned. Her parents accused her of stealing company data and turning against her own blood. She moved into a small apartment near her friend and found temporary work doing accounts payable for a plumbing contractor. I offered to help with the deposit. She accepted half and insisted on a repayment schedule. That was Avery. Even in a crisis created by other people's entitlement, she wanted her obligations named. My mobilization ended in early November. When the aircraft landed in Texas, the first thing I noticed was the smell of wet pavement. The second was how heavy my phone felt after I turned it back on. There were messages from soldiers I had served with, a notice from my civilian employer, and a voicemail from my mother. She said, please come home before you make any final decisions. We need to sit at one table. Your father would want that. The investigation had already passed beyond my ability to make final decisions. I could correct my records, cooperate, and choose my own boundaries. I could not order agencies, lenders, or prosecutors to forget what they had received. Still, I agreed to a meeting. Not at my mother's house, not at Prairie Forge, at my house outside Salina, on a Saturday afternoon, with Martin available by phone and copies of every document already stored somewhere else. My first week home was quieter than I expected. I reopened the metal building behind my property, swept dust from the workbench, and checked the tools one by one. The old military trailer sat where I had left it. Ellen's gardening gloves were stiff with age. On the wall hung a length of faded tow rope that had belonged to my father. I thought about cutting it down. Instead, I left it there. Saturday arrived, cold and bright. I made coffee nobody drank and placed 4 folders on the kitchen table. One held the ownership records. One held the lender documents. One held the inspection report. The last held the email chain from Avery's red drive. At 2 minutes after 1, a black sport utility vehicle turned into my driveway. My mother got out first. Brent came around the driver's side carrying a leather portfolio. Vanessa followed with a cardboard box of documents held against her chest. None of them looked like the people in the Nashville photographs. Brent had lost weight. Vanessa's hair was pulled back without the polished waves she wore in company videos. My mother seemed smaller than she had on the screen, though she stood very straight as she walked toward the porch. When I opened the door, she tried to hug me. I stepped aside and said, come in. Her arms lowered slowly. Brent placed the leather portfolio on my table. He did not sit until I did. We have a way to contain this, he said. That was his opening sentence. Not I am sorry. Not I used your name. Not I could have hurt someone. We have a way to contain this. He opened the portfolio and slid 3 documents toward me. A revised operating agreement. A fresh active duty designation dated 9 months earlier. A statement saying I had approved the bid, the financing, and the original supplier based on information available at the time. The final page had a blank signature line above my typed name. My mother folded her hands and whispered, please, Nathan. I looked at the line. Then I opened the first folder. The certified operating agreement lay on top. I turned it so all 3 of them could see the forged signature. This document says, I invested $120,000. I said, show me where the money came from. Brent rubbed his jaw. It was a paper contribution. Your earlier loan to the company was converted to equity. A loan made years before this company existed cannot be converted without my knowledge. Vanessa said, Martin is making this sound more criminal than it was. I had not mentioned Martin. That told me how much they had been discussing my lawyer when I was not in the room. I placed the active duty designation beside the agreement. The notary date was circled. On this date, I was in the air between Germany and Kuwait. Army travel records prove it. The rule you used is real. A reservist called to active duty can designate someone to manage a qualifying business. The designation has to come from the veteran who actually owns the business. You forged both parts. My mother said, "We thought you would agree once you understood what was at stake." I looked at her. Agreement after discovery is not permission before the act. Nobody answered that. I opened the second folder. The lender documents showed my house, my retirement income, and my military pension listed as support for the financing. Celia's fraud analysis showed the prepaid phone, the company internet address, and the false security answers. Beneath those pages was the second mortgage on my mother's house. I asked Brent why he had told her the lien would last 90 days. He said, "Because the contract should have funded by then." Should have is not a plan. It was the only plan available. "No," I said. Selling the warehouse was available. Reducing staff was available. Bankruptcy was available. Telling the truth was available. My mother flinched at the word bankruptcy as though it were more shameful than fraud. She said, "Your father spent his life building something for his sons. I could not watch it disappear. Dad built a repair shop. Brent sold it 6 years ago and kept the customer list. Prairie Forge is not Dad's shop." Brent leaned forward. "You got the land. You got the building. You gotta leave." I stayed and carried all of this. There it was, the resentment underneath the entitlement. In his version, my deployments were freedom and his choices were service. Every night I had spent in a tent, every missed holiday, every hospital corridor with Ellen while he discussed cash flow had been edited into the simple fact that I got to leave. I said, "You did not carry me. You put me on the invoice." His face reddened, but he stayed quiet. I opened the third folder. The test report was shorter than the others. Technical documents often are. A few pages of measurements can undo months of confident storytelling. I pointed to the pressure result and the material finding. One assembly separated before the required threshold. The inner material softened under heat. These parts were not accepted. Vanessa said, "They were samples. We could have corrected the next shipment." Brent said, "Nobody was hurt." I asked, "Who gave you the right to decide how close a soldier could come?" He looked away. My mother whispered, "Brent told me the parts were basically the same. Basically the same as what people say when the measurement would cost them money." I took the old red rejection tag from my pocket and set it on the report. The paper was soft at the folds after years in my notebook. A mechanic under a recovery boom does not know your company is desperate. He sees a part in the army system and assumes somebody verified it. That somebody was supposed to be me in your paperwork. The room went still. That was the moment when the story stopped being about my house, my pension, or even the forged signature. It became about the person none of us would ever meet because the unsafe part had been stopped before it reached him. Before I opened the last folder, I looked at the three people across from me and asked a question I want you to answer to. When your family asks you to sign away your future so they can escape the consequences of what they did, is refusing a betrayal, or is it the first honest thing left? Tell me in the comments where you draw that line. I already knew where mine was. I slid Brent's new documents back across the table. I will not sign them. My mother closed her eyes. Brent's voice dropped. "Then, Mom loses the house. Mom may have to sell the house. That is not the same as me losing mine for a loan I never made. You can stop it. I can join it," I said. "I cannot erase it." Vanessa pushed her chair back and stood. She said they had come for a solution, not a lecture. I told her the solution had existed before they submitted the first false page. It was to accept that Prairie Forge had failed and wind it down honestly. She sat again because my mother reached for her wrist. I opened the fourth folder. On top was the email from their accountant asking what would happen if I denied ownership. Under it was Brent's answer. He will not. If he does, the signed file makes it his problem too. I watched him read his own words. For the first time that afternoon, the confidence left his face entirely. I turned the next page. The company is in his name. The guarantee is in his name. If there is a quality issue, he's the controlling owner on record. My mother stared at Brent. "You said Nathan could never be blamed," she said. Brent did not answer. She asked again, "You told me this protected him." He said, "It protected everybody if he cooperated." That sentence did more than any argument I could have made. My mother heard the condition inside it. I was protected only if I surrendered. Vanessa said the emails were taken out of context. I asked her what context made them better. She had none. I told them Avery had preserved the files and provided them through counsel. My mother covered her mouth. Brent stood so quickly that his chair struck the wall. "She stole company property," he said. "She preserved evidence. She is my daughter." "I am your brother," I said. "That did not stop you." He began pacing beside the table. He called Avery disloyal. He called Martin an opportunist. He called the contracting officer a bureaucrat. He called me self-righteous. Each accusation pushed responsibility farther from the only person in the room who had signed the emails. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed my father's challenge coin on the table. Mom said this belonged with the company, he said. Dad would be ashamed of what you are doing to us. I looked at the coin between us. The worn edge caught the light from the kitchen window. I remembered giving it to my father in the airport after a deployment, his thick mechanic's hand closing around it. He had not been a man who said much about pride. He simply kept the coin where he could see it. I picked it up. Dad gave this back to me in every way that mattered, I said. You borrowed my picture, my status, my signature, and now his approval. You do not get to borrow this too. Brent held out his hand. I put the coin in my pocket. My mother began crying then, not the quiet bargaining tears from the phone. Her shoulders bent and her breath caught. She said she had opened the steel box. She said she had given Vanessa the folder and watched her scan every page. She admitted she knew the signature on the ownership agreement was not mine. Brent had told her it was only a placeholder until I came home. I asked why she had signed the second mortgage. She said, because he told me I would lose the house if I did not. You were already afraid of losing it. Yes. So you chose mine. She looked at me for a long time. Yes, she said. It was the first completely honest answer she had given me. Honesty did not repair the damage, but it changed the air in the room. There was no longer a misunderstanding to solve. My mother had been frightened. Brent had been desperate. Vanessa had been ambitious. Each of them had made a choice. Fear explained those choices. It did not transfer ownership of them. I told my mother I would help her speak with an independent housing counselor and a lawyer who did not represent Brent. I would help her understand the notices and plan a sale before the lender forced one. I would not pay the business debt. I would not refinance the house. I would not sign anything that made the past look authorized. She asked whether I could forgive her. I said, not today. Brent laughed once, a hard sound without humor. So that is it. 30 years in uniform and you come home to destroy your own family. I stood. No. I came home and refused to let my family use the uniform to destroy me. He stared at me, waiting for the softer sentence that usually followed. The sentence that offered money, time, or a path around the consequence. I did not give him one. My father used to say we pulled on the same rope. For years I thought that meant I had to keep pulling no matter who tied the other end or where it led. I told Brent, a rope can pull a man out of a hole. It can also be tied around his neck. You stopped asking me to help a long time ago. Nobody spoke after that. Vanessa gathered the unsigned documents. Brent left the email copies where they were. My mother stayed seated for another minute, looking at the 4 folders as though they were photographs from a life she did not recognize. At the door, she turned and asked whether Avery was all right. I said she was safe. That seemed to break something open in her face. Perhaps it was the first time she understood that safety had become a family issue and that Brent was no longer the person everyone else needed to protect. They drove away just before sunset. I stood on the porch with my father's coin in my pocket and watched the vehicle disappear between the bare cottonwoods. I did not feel victorious. I felt accurate. The months after that meeting moved slowly, which is how consequences usually move once the shouting ends. Agencies requested records. Lawyers answered letters. The Army completed its review of my disclosure and found no evidence that I had participated in the company or the bid. My early report, the revoked power of attorney, the travel records, and the preserved sign-in alerts made the timeline clear. That clearance mattered more to me than any apology my family could have offered. A military career is built one signed responsibility at a time. I was not going to let somebody else's false signature become the last line in mine. Prairie Forge lost its veteran certification. The Army contract was terminated before any hose assemblies entered service. The company was excluded from new federal work while the fraud case proceeded. Its bank took control of the warehouse inventory, and a receiver sold equipment to satisfy part of the debt. Brent eventually admitted that he had submitted false ownership and control documents and used my identity in the financing package. His lawyers negotiated the criminal and civil pieces over many months. I did not attend the plea hearing. I read the result later in a letter from the prosecutor and put it in the trace line folder. He was ordered to pay restitution, lost the right to compete for federal contracts, and spent time in federal custody. Vanessa entered a civil settlement, surrendered her interest in the company, and cooperated. The notary lost her commission and faced her own case. My mother was not charged after she provided records and testified about how the documents had been taken and used. That outcome angered some people who heard the story. They thought she deserved a harsher punishment. I was not interested in designing one. My mother's punishment was not mine to assign. It was the loss of the house she had tried to save, the collapse of the story she had told herself about Brent, and the knowledge that fear had led her to risk one son for the other. A court could not make that heavier than it already was. She sold the Wichita house before foreclosure. After the lender was paid, she had enough left for a small apartment in a senior community near Avery. I helped her move one Saturday in March. I carried boxes, I connected the television, I hung my father's photograph above a narrow bookshelf. I did not write a check. Boundaries look ordinary from the outside. Sometimes they look like lifting a couch for someone whose debt you refuse to pay. Sometimes they look like answering a question without reopening the argument. Sometimes they look like leaving at 5 because you said you would. My mother and I did not return to what we had been. That would not have been healing. What we had been was the problem. We began something smaller and more honest, one phone call a week. No financial requests, no messages passed through Brent. When she apologized, I asked her to name the act rather than the intention. At first she said, "I am sorry, everything became such a mess." Later she learned to say, "I am sorry, I gave them your records and allowed your signature to be forged because I was afraid of losing my house." The second sentence did not erase anything. It did tell the truth. Avery stayed in accounting. She took night classes in fraud examination and became very good at following money through places people assumed were too boring to inspect. She repaid the apartment deposit exactly according to the schedule she had written herself. On the final payment, she added a note, "Thank you for helping without taking over." I kept that note beside Ellen's notebook page. I retired from the army the following autumn. At the ceremony, Lyle handed me a shadow box containing my rank, ribbons, the old red rejection tag, and my father's challenge coin. He had mounted the tag above a small brass plate that read, "One bad day stopped." For once, I did not correct the sentiment for being too dramatic. Retirement lasted 6 weeks before I admitted that reorganizing my garage was not a purpose. I used the metal building on my land to start a small training workshop for veterans moving into civilian maintenance, quality assurance, and supply jobs. It was not a charity and it was not a federal contractor. Local utilities and manufacturers paid for short courses. Veterans attended at no cost. Every lesson began with the same principle. A part without traceability is only a story in a box. Avery helped set up the books. She insisted on written controls for every expense, 2 approvals for every refund, and a Friday backup stored in 2 places. We named the program Trace Line Workshop. The first class had 8 people: a former truck mechanic, a Navy electrician, a medic who wanted to work in hospital facilities, a National Guard sergeant who had spent 20 years maintaining equipment and still believed no civilian employer would understand what he knew. On the last day, I watched them stand around a workbench, comparing measurements on a worn hydraulic fitting. Nobody cared about the logo on the box. They cared about the material, the record, and whether the thing would hold when somebody trusted it. That was the first image I kept from the life after Prairie Forge. The second came a month later. The old company sign was removed from Brent's warehouse in cold rain. I happened to drive past while 2 workers lowered it from the brick wall. The painted flag disappeared first, then the word Prairie, then Forge. By the time I reached the next stoplight, there was only a pale rectangle where the promise had been. The third image came on the morning we opened a second training bay. My mother arrived early, carrying a brown wooden case against her chest. I knew it before she set it down. My father's micrometer. For years, I had believed Brent sold it after the funeral. My mother told me she had found it in the steel document box while packing the house. Beneath the tool was an envelope in my father's handwriting. The paper had yellowed at the edges. My name was written across the front. I opened it at the workbench where Avery was checking the class roster. Inside was a short note. "Nathan, this belongs to you. Brent knows how to sell a repair. You know how to make one last. Never confuse the two." Dad, I read it twice. My mother said she was sorry she had not found it sooner. I believed she might have found it years earlier and put it away because giving it to me would have forced her to see something she was not ready to see. I also believed she was finally ready now. Both things could be true. I placed the micrometer in the new training bay, not behind glass, but in the top drawer where students could use it. Tools are not honored by being protected from work. Avery watched me close the drawer. "Looks like Grandpa knew," she said. "Yes," I told her. He measured twice. Outside, the first group of veterans was arriving. My mother's small car sat beside Avery's. The old tow rope from my father's shop hung on the wall, cleaned but not cut. For most of my life, I had thought family meant staying tied to whatever other people chose. I know better now. Family's not the rope. Family's the person who checks whether the knot will hold, tells you when it will not, and refuses to let you stand underneath something built on a lie. My brother used my service as a costume, my name as collateral, and my silence as part of his business plan. He believed the uniform would make me easier to control. In the end, it taught me the opposite.